In the summer of 2008, a small lakeside town in Italy harbored a secret melody. A hauntingly beautiful violin played every night, drifting over the water and into the ears of a reclusive painter. Drawn by the ethereal sound, she ventures into the unknown, uncovering a story of passion, loss, and forbidden love under the moonlight. July 3, 2008. The town of Lago di Luna rested at the foot of the Italian Alps, a place where the air always carried a faint scent of pine and the waters of the lake mirrored the stars above. Elena Ferrara had arrived in this quiet town 3 months earlier, hoping to leave behind the chaos of her life in Florence. At just 29, her name had already gained modest recognition in the art world, but her personal life was a patchwork of heartbreak. A love that once felt eternal had ended in betrayal, leaving her questioning not only her relationships but also her art. Her works, once vibrant and full of color, had turned muted, her creativity drowned in sadness. Elena's new home was a small cottage on the edge of town. It stood high above the lake, its balcony offering an unobstructed view of the silvery waters below. She had chosen it because it was secluded, surrounded by old cypress trees that seemed to whisper in the wind. Each night, she would sit by her window, a brush in hand, trying to capture inspiration that seemed just out of reach. It was on one such night, with the clock striking midnight, that the first notes drifted into her world. The violin's melody floated through the open window, so faint it could have been mistaken for the wind if not for its haunting beauty. Elena froze, her brush hovering above the blank canvas. The music was unlike anything she had ever heard, both mournful and enchanting, like a memory of love and loss intertwined. It seemed to pull at her very soul, igniting a flicker of inspiration she thought she had lost forever. The music played for an hour, and though she wanted to follow it, she felt paralyzed by its raw emotion. As the last note faded at precisely 1 a.m., she felt as though a spell had been broken, leaving her longing for more. July 6. By the third night, the violin's melody had become a part of Elena's life. Each evening, she would prepare her sketchbook and sit on her balcony, waiting for the music to begin. The pattern was always the same. The first note would drift across the lake at midnight, and the haunting tune would continue until 1 a.m. The consistency was almost unnerving, yet it gave her something to anticipate, something to fill the void her heartbreak had left behind. The music seemed to speak to her, painting pictures in her mind that her hands eagerly translated into sketches. Each drawing became a reflection of the melody, a swirl of blues for the sorrowful tones, silvers for the glimmers of hope, and deep blacks for the undertones of despair. Her art began to feel alive again, and for the first time in months, she felt a connection to her craft. Despite her fascination, she couldn't shake the mystery of the music. No one in the town seemed to hear it. She asked the baker when she stopped by for bread, the elderly woman who sold lavender by the market square, even the boy who delivered her groceries. They all gave her the same puzzled look, shrugging as if she had imagined it. This only deepened her intrigue. Who was the musician? Why did they play every night with such precision? And why was she the only one who seemed to notice? July 8. On the night of the full moon, Elena decided she could no longer simply listen. Her curiosity had grown into an obsession, and she felt an almost magnetic pull toward the music source. As the clock neared midnight, she wrapped herself in a shawl and stepped out into the cool night air. The path to the lake was overgrown, lined with wildflowers that glowed pale under the moonlight. The trees formed a canopy above her, their shadows dancing with each gust of wind. The only sound was the crunch of her boots on the gravel path and the faint strains of the violin growing louder with each step. When she reached the lake's edge, the sight took her breath away. The water was a mirror of the night sky, its surface shimmering with moonlight. And there, on a small clearing near the shore, stood a man. His back was to her, but she could see the graceful movements of his arm as he played the violin. The music was raw, full of passion and pain, as if the instrument itself wept in his hands. The man's silhouette was framed by the moon, his figure tall and lean, but his presence seemed almost otherworldly. Elena stood frozen, afraid that the slightest movement would break the spell. She noticed how his body swayed with the rhythm of the music, every note an extension of himself. He played as though he were pouring his very soul into the melody, and for a moment, Elena felt as if she were intruding on something deeply personal. Yet she couldn't look away. Before she could gather the courage to step closer, the music stopped. The man lowered his violin, tilting his head slightly, as if he sensed her presence. Elena's heart raced, but before she could call out or take a step forward, he vanished into the shadows of the trees, leaving behind only the faint echo of his melody. She stood there for what felt like an eternity, her mind swirling with questions and her heart aching with a strange new emotion. As she walked back to her cottage in the early hours of July 9, 2008, Elena couldn't shake the feeling that her life had shifted in some irrevocable way. She didn't know who the mysterious violinist was or why his music felt so deeply personal, but she was certain of one thing. She would return to the lake, and she would find him again. July 10, 2008. The soft rustle of leaves filled the night air as Elena made her way back to the lake. She clutched her sketchbook tightly, her heart pounding with a mixture of excitement and trepidation. The melody had called her again, and this time, she was determined to find the man who played it. She reached the clearing just as the first notes began to float across the water. The scene was as breathtaking as before. The moon hung low in the sky, bathing the lake in a silvery glow, and there he was, the mysterious violinist, standing where she had last seen him. Elena sat at a distance, her sketchbook open on her lap. She didn't draw immediately, afraid the scratch of pencil on paper might disturb the delicate beauty of the moment. She observed the man intently, noting the precision in his movements, the way his body seemed to merge with the music. There was a sorrow in his posture, a weight that she could feel even from afar. She found herself captivated not just by the music but by him, a figure of solitude and passion. When the music stopped at exactly 1 a.m., Elena hesitated for a moment before stepping forward. Her footsteps were quiet, deliberate, as she approached the man. He turned toward her, and for the first time, she saw his face. He was younger than she had imagined, his features sharp and refined, but his eyes held a depth of sadness that startled her. His expression was not one of anger at being interrupted but of curiosity, as though he had been expecting her. The two stood in silence at first, their connection unspoken but undeniable. Slowly, they began to talk, their words tentative, like the opening notes of a new melody. The man introduced himself as Matteo Ricci, a violinist who had once graced some of the grandest stages in Europe. But he had been living in solitude for the past 5 years, drawn to the quiet of the lake to escape the chaos of his former life. As he spoke, Elena listened intently, sensing that his story was layered with pain. He explained that he played every night not for an audience, but for someone he had lost, his wife, Isabella. Elena noticed the way his voice softened when he mentioned Isabella, a tenderness that revealed the depth of his love. She learned that Isabella had been his muse, the reason behind his greatest compositions. But now she was gone, and the music he played was no longer a celebration of their love but a lament for her absence. He admitted that coming to the lake each night was his way of keeping her memory alive. As Elena listened, she felt an ache in her chest, a recognition of his grief that mirrored her own heartbreak. Without speaking it aloud, they both understood the burden of loving and losing. July 12. 2 nights later, Elena returned to the lake, unable to stay away. Matteo was already there, his violin resting on a nearby tree stump. He greeted her with a faint smile, the tension of their first meeting replaced by a quiet familiarity. They sat together by the water, and this time, Matteo asked about her. She spoke of her life in Florence, how she had fallen in love with art as a child, inspired by her grandmother's vivid oil paintings. She shared how she had poured her soul into her work, only to feel it slip away after her heartbreak. She described how she had come to Lago di Luna, hoping to find herself again. Matteo listened intently, his gaze never leaving her as she spoke. When she showed him the sketches she had drawn while listening to his music, his eyes softened. He marveled at how her art captured the essence of his melodies, how she seemed to understand the emotions he poured into each note. For the first time in years, Matteo felt as though someone truly saw him, not just as a musician but as a man carrying a weight too heavy to bear alone. Over the next few nights, their meetings became routine. Matteo would play, and Elena would sketch, their shared silence more comforting than words. They began to explore each other's art, with Matteo explaining the intricacies of his compositions and Elena describing the techniques behind her brushstrokes. Matteo even showed her the violin he played, a rare Stradivarius with delicate carvings on its scroll. He revealed that it had been a gift from Isabella, a symbol of their shared love for music. The violin was not just an instrument, it was a part of their story, and each note he played on it was infused with her memory. As they spent more time together, Elena felt a shift within herself. The pain of her past began to fade, replaced by a quiet hope she hadn't felt in years. She realized that Matteo was doing for her what she was doing for him, helping to heal wounds that neither of them thought could ever close. Yet, even as she felt herself growing closer to him, she noticed that he often gazed out at the lake, his expression distant, as though he were searching for something, or someone, he couldn't reach. July 15th. It was on their 5th meeting that Matteo finally shared the story he had been holding back. They were sitting by the lake as always, the moonlight casting long shadows on the water. Matteo's voice was steady, but there was a tremor beneath it as he spoke of the night Isabella had died. He confessed that her death had not been an accident, at least not entirely. The memory of their final argument was etched into his mind, a storm of words that had spiraled out of control. He had accused her of not understanding his dedication to his music, and she had called him selfish, saying he cared more about his violin than their life together. Matteo described how Isabella had stormed out, her footsteps echoing in the hallway as she left the house. He had thought she would return after cooling off, but minutes later, the sound of screeching tires and a deafening crash shattered the night. When he reached the scene, it was too late. Her car had plunged into the lake. He told Elena that the image of the submerged car, the ripples on the water, and the silence that followed had haunted him ever since. He admitted that he played every night in the hope that Isabella could hear him, that his music might reach her wherever she was. He believed that her spirit lingered by the lake, drawn to the melodies they had once shared. As he finished his story, Matteo's gaze fell to the ground, and Elena felt tears welling in her eyes. She wanted to comfort him, but she knew that his pain was something only he could face. That night, as Elena walked back to her cottage, she felt the weight of Matteo's grief pressing on her. Yet, she also felt a deeper connection to him, a bond forged through their shared understanding of loss. She knew that she couldn't save him from his past, but she hoped that, together, they could find a way to move forward. July 20th, 2008. The nights had become eerily quiet for Elena and Matteo, despite the music that bound them. Every evening, Matteo's violin sang to the lake, its haunting melodies filling the air. Yet, as the days passed, Elena began to notice subtle changes, things she couldn't quite explain. The first instance occurred while she was painting near the water's edge. She had just begun a new piece, a soft landscape of the lake bathed in moonlight, when she felt a strange chill brush across her neck. Her hand faltered, the brush slipping and smudging the canvas with a deep streak of black. She frowned, trying to fix the error, but as she worked, the canvas tore sharply, as if an unseen hand had sliced through it. When she examined the tear, she froze. The shape it had formed was unmistakable, the faint outline of a woman's face, her features blurred yet hauntingly familiar. The strange events didn't stop there. Shadows seemed to dance in her peripheral vision, flickering at the corners of her eyes only to vanish when she turned to look. At first, she dismissed them as tricks of the light, her mind playing games with her. But the whispers were harder to ignore. They came at night, during Matteo's performances. Soft at first, like a breeze rustling through the trees, they grew louder as the music intensified. Words were indistinct, but the tone was sorrowful, almost accusatory. Elena couldn't shake the feeling that they were meant for her. When she mentioned these occurrences to Matteo, he dismissed them with a quiet shake of his head. He assured her that the lake had always had an eerie stillness about it, and that the strange happenings were likely her imagination. But his explanation felt hollow, and Elena couldn't ignore the unease that grew within her. Deep down, she was certain that Isabella's spirit was trying to reach them. July 22nd. That night, Elena's sleep was restless. The whispers seemed to follow her into her dreams, growing louder and more insistent. In the dream, she found herself standing by the lake, the water unnaturally calm. The moonlight illuminated a figure emerging from the depths. It was Isabella, her form ethereal but unmistakable. Her eyes glowed with an intensity that sent shivers down Elena's spine. She seemed angry, her movements sharp and deliberate as she approached. Though her lips didn't move, her voice echoed in Elena's mind, cold and accusing. The dream ended abruptly, leaving Elena gasping for breath. She awoke with a sense of dread, her heart racing as she tried to shake off the vivid images. She couldn't ignore the warning. It felt like Isabella was trying to keep her away from Matteo, to protect her place in his heart even from beyond the grave. The dream left her shaken, but also resolute. Elena refused to be driven away by a shadow of the past. She needed to confront Matteo and share what she had seen. When she told Matteo about the dream, she noticed how his face grew pale, his hands trembling slightly as he held the violin. He didn't dismiss her this time. Instead, he admitted his own fears. He confessed that he often felt a presence when he played, as though Isabella was still there, listening to every note. While part of him found comfort in the thought, another part felt trapped, unable to move on. He spoke of the guilt he carried, the belief that his music had cost Isabella her life. Matteo was torn between the memory of his wife and the new emotions he had begun to feel for Elena. As he spoke, Elena felt a pang of sorrow for him. His pain was so deeply rooted that it seemed impossible for him to let go. She wanted to tell him that it was okay to move forward, that loving her didn't mean betraying Isabella. But she could see how fragile he was, how torn, and she knew he needed time to reconcile the emotions pulling him in different directions. July 25th. The night was unnaturally still. The usual hum of crickets and rustling leaves was absent, leaving the air heavy with tension. Matteo began to play his violin as he always did, standing at the edge of the lake while Elena watched from a distance. But tonight, the melody felt different. It was darker, more anguished, as though his soul was pouring out every ounce of pain and longing. Elena closed her eyes, letting the music wash over her, when suddenly, a piercing scream shattered the night. Her eyes snapped open to see Matteo frozen in place, his bow hovering above the strings. The scream echoed again, louder this time, and the air around them seemed to thicken. One by one, the violin strings snapped, the sound sharp and jarring. Matteo dropped the instrument, his hands shaking as he took a step back. Elena's gaze turned toward the lake, where the water had begun to ripple violently despite the still air. From the center of the disturbance, a figure emerged. It was Isabella. Her form was translucent, her features pale and distorted. Her hair floated around her like dark tendrils, and her eyes glowed with a mix of sorrow and fury. She seemed to hover above the water, her voice rising above the now silent night. Isabella's presence was overwhelming, her emotions radiating like waves crashing onto the shore. Elena felt an icy chill grip her as the apparition turned toward Matteo. Isabella's voice filled the air, accusing him of betrayal. She demanded to know why he had abandoned her memory, why he dared to find comfort in another. Her rage was palpable, and yet, beneath it, there was a deep, aching sadness. Matteo fell to his knees, his hands covering his face as though to block out the vision. He looked utterly broken, torn between the guilt that had haunted him for years and the love he had begun to feel for Elena. Isabella's gaze shifted to Elena, her expression darkening. Elena stood her ground, though her legs trembled, refusing to let fear consume her. The lake fell silent once more, the water stilling as Isabella's figure faded back into the depths. The air remained cold, heavy with the aftermath of her presence. Matteo sat motionless, his violin lying broken at his feet. Elena approached him slowly, placing a trembling hand on his shoulder. Neither of them spoke, but they both understood the truth. The past was not ready to let them go. July 27, 2008. Elena and Matteo sat in the dimly lit kitchen of Signora Moretti's ancient stone cottage, the air heavy with the scent of burning sage. The elderly woman, her face weathered like the pages of an old book, listened intently as they recounted the events of the past weeks. Her dark eyes narrowed with a mix of sympathy and concern, and she nodded slowly, as though piecing together a puzzle only she could see. Known throughout Lago di Luna for her deep knowledge of folklore and the supernatural, Signora Moretti had helped many in the town understand the mysteries of the lake, and now, she was their only hope. She told them that spirits tied to tragic deaths often lingered, unable to move on until their emotions were resolved. Isabella's spirit, she explained, was caught in a cycle of sorrow and anger, tethered to Matteo by his guilt and the unfinished chapter of their love. For Isabella to find peace, Matteo had to confront his own pain. He needed to play not for her memory, but for himself, to release the grief he had carried for years. Only then could the bond between them be broken. Elena watched Matteo closely as Signora Moretti spoke. His face was pale, his hands gripping the edge of the table so tightly his knuckles whitened. She could see the weight of the suggestion sinking into him. The thought of playing a final piece for Isabella, one that would truly mark the end of their connection, seemed to terrify him. For so long, his music had been his way of keeping her close, a fragile thread that tied him to the life they had shared. Letting go felt like losing her all over again. Elena reached for Matteo's hand, her touch gentle but firm. She didn't speak, but her eyes held his, conveying all the strength and reassurance she could offer. They were in this together, and she wouldn't let him face this alone. Signora Moretti handed Matteo a small vial of oil, explaining it was meant to anoint the violin, a ritual to honor Isabella's spirit before the performance. Matteo accepted it with a trembling hand, nodding in silent agreement. The stage was set for the final act, one that would determine whether they could move forward or remain trapped in the shadow of the past. July 29th. The night was still, the air thick with anticipation as the moon rose high above the lake, casting its silver glow across the water. Elena stood on the shore, her heart pounding as she watched Matteo prepare. He wore a simple black shirt, his usual calm demeanor replaced by a quiet intensity. The antique Stradivarius rested in his hands, its wood glinting faintly in the moonlight. The vial of oil sat nearby, its contents shimmering like liquid gold. Matteo carefully anointed the violin, whispering a silent prayer, his movements deliberate and reverent. This was no ordinary performance. It was a farewell. The first note rang out, piercing the silence like a blade. Matteo's bow moved gracefully across the strings, each stroke filled with raw emotion. The music was unlike anything Elena had heard before, a blend of sorrow, love, regret, and hope. It was as if Matteo's soul was speaking through the instrument, telling a story that words could never convey. The melody rose and fell, echoing across the lake and up into the starry sky. As the music grew more intense, the air around them seemed to shift. The surface of the lake rippled despite the absence of wind, and a faint mist began to rise. Elena's breath caught in her throat as a figure emerged from the haze. It was Isabella, her ghostly form more defined than ever before. Her hair flowed like dark water, and her eyes, though filled with sadness, no longer burned with anger. She stood motionless, listening to the music, her gaze fixed on Matteo. Elena stayed rooted to her spot, her heart aching at the sight. She could feel the love between Matteo and Isabella, a bond forged in life and strained by death. But she also felt a shift, a subtle release, as Matteo continued to play. The music spoke of acceptance, of forgiveness. It was not a plea to hold on but a gentle goodbye. As the final notes hung in the air, Isabella began to move. Her expression softened, a faint smile forming on her lips. She raised her hand, as if reaching out to touch Matteo, but stopped just short. Her form shimmered, becoming lighter and less distinct, as though she were dissolving into the moonlight itself. The last thing Elena heard was a whisper, a soft thank you carried on the wind, as Isabella's figure faded completely. Matteo lowered the violin, his hands trembling. He stood there for a long moment, staring at the spot where Isabella had been, the silence around him both heavy and liberating. Elena approached him slowly, her steps careful, as though afraid to break the fragile peace that had settled over them. She placed a hand on his shoulder, and this time he turned to her. His eyes filled not with sorrow but with a quiet sense of release. The lake returned to its calm state, the mist dissipating as if it had never been. The moonlight continued to dance on the water, but the air felt lighter, as though a weight had been lifted. Elena and Matteo stayed by the lake until dawn, their hands entwined as they watched the first rays of sunlight break over the horizon. The past had finally been laid to rest, and for the first time, the future felt possible. With Isabella's spirit at peace, Matteo feels a weight lifted. He and Elena begin to explore their relationship without the shadow of the past. Elena finishes a painting inspired by the Serenade, a vivid scene of the lake under moonlight, capturing both the sorrow and beauty of their journey. Matteo donates Isabella's violin to a local museum, ensuring her memory lives on. As he and Elena walk hand in hand by the lake, a soft breeze carries a faint melody. They smile, knowing that while the past may linger, it no longer holds them captive. What will their future hold? Only time, and the moonlight, will tell.